concepts and the world out there. And that world out there could be our world, the African world, but it could also be the world in general. So what that relationship looks like, and what we do to the world when we approach it in that way. So I think we are right at the center of one of the most important issues that needs to be discussed in connection with the topic of our summer school. So that's what we're going to do today. I've actually got about 3 points to discuss this morning. I want to start with a brief or long discussion on what I look at as the life of concepts. I think concepts have a life. Sometimes we are not aware of that. And becoming aware of it may be useful in grappling with what concerns us in this summer school. I want to have a brief discussion on that. But then I want to use that discussion to clear the ground for what I think is at issue. So what are the stakes of the whole thing? And I think one of the most crucial stakes in the discussion we are conducting in this summer school is the notion of translation. Because I think that it would be fair to suggest the idea that doing research is translating. When we do research, we are translating. Either, translating concepts into reality, or even translating normative and epistemological assumptions into objects. So I think we need to discuss that, and I'll be giving you some inputs to structure that discussion. And then, sorry. And then I will refer to a notion which I would like to use in lieu of the concept, so the notion of category. And I will explain later on what I mean by that, why I think it's necessary perhaps to replace or to think about these issues with reference to the notion of categories. So those are going to be the three substantive things which we are going to do this morning. And then, as usual, we'll give us an assignment for this afternoon, which we're going to do as group work. I always keep forgetting to maintain a professorial pose. Femi is around. Okay. You'll excuse me now. Okay, so that's what we are going to do today. There was an unofficial assignment yesterday, but we're not going to do it. But maybe it will come up at some stage in our discussions. But if you remember, we had this interesting discussion, this interesting and frustrating discussion in the afternoon about the things that we do not know, which is very, very challenging. And as I was suggesting yesterday, I think that's a crucial moment in research. Because as I said yesterday, there's a paradox underlying knowledge production. And that paradox is that the more you know, the more you realize that you don't know, right? So it's not like it's the less you know, but it's that you realize that there's so much you don't know, right? And so it's almost as if knowledge production were the production of ignorance, right? And I do think that it's important to be aware of that. And that is why I also suggested early in this seminar, in this summer school, that it's really important when you do your research to bear in mind that at the end of it, you're not going to have only an answer, you're going to have a bigger question. That's what you should, that's the goal of research, to have a bigger question. And that bigger question is actually the question which you should have raised when Godwin Moronga, our executive secretary, asked you about how you want to be remembered. So what is the relevance of your work to your discipline, to the subject matter that you are addressing? Perhaps even since this is the context within which we find ourselves, what is the relevance of your work to Africa, to African worlds, and to African lives? What is that big question that you will end up with, which is likely to make all the difference? And that is where also our intellectual ambition lies. So when we talk about an intellectual ambition, that's what we mean. And that is important also because I think we need to be modest enough to know how little we know. I mean, nobody's immune to this, but it's often the case that we move around the world somehow with the feeling that actually we know everything that we should know about the things that we are addressing. And maybe we don't. Maybe we don't. I mean, if you look at all the publications that there are on the African continent, publications produced not only by non-Africans but also by Africans, documenting all the problems facing Africa, suggesting solutions, and so on. And yet, the continent looks the way it does. So obviously, there's something we don't know, right? Because if what we claim to know were really enough, not just valid, but if it were enough, then maybe we shouldn't have all the problems that we're having. And of course, we can move into conspiracy theories and say, well, we are like this because the others don't want us to be better, right? We can move into that. So we should also have the knowledge that would allow us to escape those people who do not want us to be better. So I think doing research is an exercise in learning to be humble, in learning to be intellectually modest. And that is why thinking about objectivity is important. That is why thinking about science is important. And that is why maybe we could even use as our motto the statement by the late Cameroonian philosopher Fabien Ebusi Bulaga, I mentioned here earlier on, when he said, if we really want to survive, we have to make sure that we do philosophy seriously, right? And instead of philosophy, I could say science, Instead of science, I could say research. Instead of research, I could say knowledge production. Okay. So I brought you this picture here. Um, you see W.B. Du Bois, the great African American sociologist, perhaps the greatest. And he was the first African American to get a PhD at the University of Harvard in the US. And what I find interesting about him is what he said upon receiving that PhD. He said, "The honor, I assure you, was Harvard's." I would like us to discuss that. You know, when you read that, of course, it's always good also to say how you feel when you read that, but also what that is telling you about anything. What comes to your mind? Knowing everything that you think you know, what comes to your mind when you read that kind of reaction to that momentous event? Okay, the floor is yours. Right? No chocolate. No chocolate. You know, because there's a problem with chocolate, a colonial problem. Because you see, it's called Swiss chocolate, but the main ingredient is African. Okay. I'm going to use that now every time people ask me for chocolate. Okay, so there we are. Du Bois. Yes, please.
I think what Dubois means about this is that what he learned in Harvard hasn't benefited him. Um, it didn't talk much about him and his people, but rather about the people that Harvard belonged to. Thank you.
The people that, okay, people that Harvard belongs to. Okay. Okay.
Pour moi, à travers cette déclaration de Webb Dubois, c'est il veut par là dire que pour lui, à travers ses études à Harvard, il a démontré la capacité de l'homme noir dans le processus à travers son intelligibilité. Le fait d'avoir été le premier homme noir à avoir obtenu un diplôme à Harvard, c'est de montrer que les intellectuels africains, eux aussi, ont cette même capacité que l'homme blanc pour pour faire des études et puis devenir intellectuel. Intellectuel, c'est pas seulement la couleur, c'est là, ça se passe dans la tête.
Okay, I like that, but there's a slight problem, and that's one of the issues I wanted to look at in the discussion here. Because yes, I think that we can say, and Aurelie is quite right in saying that, we can say that that situation shows us that, you know, everybody, every human being has intellectual capacity and ability, right? So that's one thing. Yeah, but there's another thing that it is showing at the same time, you know. And that other thing has nothing to do with our ability as black people to prove to anyone that we are what they think we are not, but it's something else. What is it?
Ok, merci. Moi, par contre, je vois que cette déclaration de Dubois montre que c'est Ava qui l'a façonné. C'est-à-dire, c'est à l'université d'Harvard qu'il a été formé, qu'il a été, disons, façonné. Et il est un produit d'Harvard. Donc, dire que l'honneur revenait à Harvard, c'est juste que si c'était peut-être une autre université, l'honneur allait revenir à cette autre université qu'il a vue grandir ou étudier pour avoir tout ce qu'il a comme ressources intellectuelles et autres. Donc, c'est juste ce que je pense.
Okay, yeah, but there's more to it, because that would simply be suggesting, you know, it would come across as if uh, Du Bois is being arrogant, and maybe he's got every right to be arrogant, right? When he suggests that, you know, any university that trains me should be proud of that. But I think there's more to it.
Could he be suggesting that it's an honor for Harvard University to have him?
Well, yeah, that's what he appears to be saying.
That's what I
And
can.
we want to say what that means.
Okay.
I'm not sure, but as I perceive it, for me, it's like he's saying that um, i- for Harvard, it's like there are those structures that are there that he's supposed to abide to. So he did the PhD based on that. So it is an honor for Harvard to have that PhD. I'm just thinking they achieved whatever they wanted to achieve through his research.
I'm not sure I got you. What is an honor for Harvard?
Okay, the structures, or maybe I'd say the concept he was doing research, maybe it was given by Harvard. So now he was doing research on those concepts. So after completion, it was an honor for Harvard to have that product, I think. Yes.
Got it now. Just a minute there.
I'm thinking that it might be that it is not easy to study at Harvard. And there are a lot of hurdles to enroll with Harvard. And once you are enrolled at Harvard and you complete your PhD, it is an honor to Harvard because of the hurdles that you have to go through before you can enroll with them.
Okay, thank you.
Merci. Tout d'abord, je voudrais, en fait, puisqu'il y a, bon, avant la déclaration, il y a quelque chose qui ne me plaît pas. Quand parfois j'entends le premier homme noir à obtenir un doctorat, le premier homme noir à avoir découvert ceci, on ne parle pas souvent de l'humain. Bon, je trouve ce premier propos, le premier homme noir, bon, je le trouve toujours raciste. Deuxièmement, en fait, si je viens à la déclaration, je pense que il fait ici honneur à la connaissance, au savoir, pour en fait montrer sa modestie. parce qu'il pouvait dire que l'honneur était moi, mais il dit que l'honneur n'est pas en fait moi. On a l'impression qu'en fait, il s'efface, il disparaît, il ramène cet honneur non pas en lui-même, mais en la connaissance. Et de ce point de vue, je pense qu'en faisant allusion à avoir, il fait allusion effectivement à la connaissance, au savoir. Et de manière concrète, ce que nous voyons exactement, c'est tout simplement la modestie intellectuelle qui caractérise cette déclaration-là. On voit en fait l'identité même de l'intellectuel, l'identité de l'homme de science, qui doit effectivement être humble, un homme de science doit être modeste, un homme de science ne doit pas être fier de la connaissance acquise, effectivement, de se dire qu'il est en train de rendre service à la science, il est en train de rendre service au savoir. Je pense qu'ici, on pouvait même reformuler la déclaration pour dire que l'honneur, je vous l'assure, était celui de la science ou bien celui même de la connaissance. Donc, moi, je remarque que Web du Bois s'est complètement effacé, c'est complètement il disparaît, il ne met pas sa personnalité devant, il ne met pas sa personne devant, mais il met la science, le savoir devant tout. Merci.
Thank you very much. I think this is where we come to an issue that's been with us all week, and that's the issue of the innocence of concepts. Are concepts innocent? Can we approach concepts as if they were innocent? And then, of course, the historical context within which things become real and meaningful. So I'll listen to a few more people who've raised their hands. Yeah. Yeah.
Merci, professeur. Moi, ce que j'aimerais dire, c'est que au travers de la déclaration de Webb, ce qui veut nous faire comprendre ici, c'est cette reconnaissance du mérite, sinon de ses qualités à pouvoir produire une thèse qui a été faite au-delà des frontières africaines. Donc, moi, c'est la mise en avant de la compétence d'une personne à pouvoir produire une thèse, bien qu'en soi, ce soit le premier noir qui a eu cette thèse-là à Harvard. Merci.
Thank you. Yes.
Okay, thank you. I think he wants us to say his intention is working with them, not working for them. Rather, that is the issue of being self. And he also wants us to give recognition that their contributions in having a PhD within Harvard, but he's still standing for Africans, not for Harvards. That is what I understand.
Thank you. Yeah.
I think he had to work within certain restrictions. And at the end of the day, he couldn't fully express himself in the way that he wanted. But his expression was controlled by the institution.
Okay, I'm not sure I understood that.
I think the institution had its own politics about how, in terms of how they wanted to represent themselves to the world. So he had to abide by certain rules. So he couldn't really represent himself in the way that he chose. He had to represent himself in terms of, based on Harvard's terms.
Okay.
For me, I'll say based on the now context on how the very first Black Americans who got educated in the Western education system, there's a theme that comes out that they were, the work they produced was not for the people, for the liberation of their people. So in that statement, that it is an honor for, because even maybe the work that he had to work on, the topics were not his own choice. and they have no impact really on his own, but to Harvard, to be seen as this space that opens space for Black people. Because another person who did that, the same after finishing his PhD, is James Cone, on because his PhD was on Bath, and he was not interested in writing about Bath and Niebuhr, but because he was forced to see things through Bath's theology. Then just after that, he wrote a PhD on Black theology and Black power. And then he says there, I could honor Black people, the civil rights movement, because therefore I was completely myself. So that means Harvard, but not me yet. And we see now, after his work, what he wrote about.
Okay, thank you. Mhm.
Thank you. Good morning. To me, it's difficult to come up with the mind at which the author or the person in question we're talking about, in the sense that one can, if you want to look at it in the current situation, I will tempt to believe in what some of my colleagues has said, that the man is trying to give honor back to the institution that impacted him with the knowledge, and that he, out of humility, he did not deserve the honor. Instead, the Harvard deserved the honor. But looking at it critically, we will understand that the man in question was a Negro, and he lived among the white at that time. So if I am to analyze or say something about this quotation, which I did not know the reason of him saying, because I have not seen a preceding statement to explain the quotation. So I will view to say that he's speaking out of experience, what he has passed through in the university, and probably the politics of knowledge that was going around at that time. Because based on what you've just said, if he's the first Negro to have a PhD in that university, he must have break a lot of protocols that were laid, for them to follow. And he also must have faced a lot of challenge to be able to show his potential. And we know how it all started, even before the slave trade. So I think even in some parts of Europe is still happening, and whereby people are being discriminated because of their color, even in Asia, which we believe, we thought, or maybe we are almost the same, where you will walk and somebody will come and touch your skin to think whether you are dirty or not. So that is the hard fact. The hard fact is based on the time of demand. He's talking out of experience of what he passed through in Harvard and the politics of knowledge that was going on around that time. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Florence.
Okay. If I can interpret what he said to be that Harvard is privileged to have produced him, I think it implies that he recognizes his own invaluable intellectual capacity as a Black man, and hence his contribution towards enriching the wealth of his discipline in that university, bearing in mind that in that historical context of racism, whatever a white person would do once, a Black man might have to do it 3 times or more, much more, to be able to gain that recognition. So it implies that he has gone the extra mile to prove himself, and he would be able, he's a giant in his own right. I guess that's what he means. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Oh, she covered it. Yeah. Okay. Any more? Perhaps I can ask the question in a slightly different manner. Some of you already addressed those aspects that are entailed in the question that I want to ask now. And the question is the following: what do we need to know in order to understand his statement? What do we need to know in order to understand the statement? And of course, it follows from that whether we know that. This is yesterday's exercise.
I think what we need to know is his historical context.
You don't want to elaborate on that?
Okay, the historical context of racism, black deprivation, of course, which affects every aspect of blackness and whiteness, educational inequality in education and everything, deprivation, poverty. So, for him to break those barriers and gain the privilege of being recognized, because even though that time whites believe that lack of intelligence is associated with blackness, or the black race is associated with low intelligence, and whiteness is associated with intellectual supremacy. So I think it was that history that shaped this statement. He has broken free from those barriers.
I think you are basically right. But you see, if that were the case, it would not follow that he would return the honor to Harvard.
Okay, following up on that, I think he's having recognized these things, he's affirming that Harvard is now privileged to have a black man triumph. And no, maybe someone else can continue. Thank you.
Bonjour, merci beaucoup. Alors, je rejoins la collègue Florence quand elle parle du contexte qui est évidemment nécessaire pour comprendre cette assertion. Je suis tout à fait d'accord, il y a le contexte historique de l'époque, un contexte de racisme ambiant. Et je pense que de ce point de vue-là, l'honneur qui est fait à Harvard, c'est d'avoir osé, dans un contexte de racisme, d'avoir osé accueillir en fait des étudiants noirs, à l'instar de Dubois, et de lui avoir permis de faire un doctorat. Je pense que c'est le fait que Harvard a eu le courage, si vous voulez, de sortir des sentiers battus et d'accueillir un étudiant noir et de lui permettre de compléter sa thèse de doctorat. Et je finirai par dire que, en réalité, souvent dans les luttes que nous menons contre le racisme, il ne faudrait pas en fait que nous prenions les Blancs comme systématiquement des adversaires. Il peut y avoir parmi les Blancs des gens qui sont tout à fait disposés à combattre le racisme. Donc, de ce point de vue-là, ces gens-là doivent être pris comme des alliés. Il faudrait éviter ce que Jean-Paul Sartre avait dit quand il disait que la négritude est un racisme antiraciste. Il faudrait que, dans cette dynamique de combattre le racisme, que nous ne soyons pas également racistes envers les autres. Donc, de ce point de vue-là, s'il y a des gens parmi ces peuples blancs-là qui sont tout à fait contre le racisme, il n'y a pas de mal à s'allier avec eux pour, si vous voulez, davantage d'inclusion et de tolérance. Je vous remercie.
No, I think that makes sense, but it's two statements, and I think generally speaking, those statements could go together, perhaps not in this context. So your first statement, I think, is really crucial. And when you emphasize the courage of Harvard University to take that step, I think that's a crucial element in what Du Bois is saying. Now, the second statement about whether some white people are racist or not racist, that's slightly different. I don't think that that plays a role in what he is saying. He's actually putting them on the spot precisely because of that, right? So I think you are spot on concerning the first part of what you've just said. Okay. Mhm.
Sorry, now I forgot the question. Uh, but I guess what I wanted to say was that the context, and the historical experience of Black Americans. So even if Harvard would have opened that space for him to be there, but now everything that is in Harvard is against that, because Harvard was created for certain people, of people who think like this. And so therefore, to be there as a Black body, you to go on through that. So it's like he made it against all odds. Like there were hurdles in each and every turn, going to the admin to go to. So because of that history, therefore, and that experience, and the fact that also, I don't know if Harvard wanted to have him, but historical context, times forced Harvard to consider having that Black man there because of the sake of time and space where they are, because most of these institutions don't want us there, but because of the time and the space that is happening now, they have to look like, that they've integrated, or they have. So that's why it's the Harvard's privilege, actually, that he allowed himself to be used as that.
Good.
I think for me, it just makes me wonder, did they allow him to be part of the institution to prove that he could succeed or to show that he couldn't?
I think that's a good question. So because my question was, what do we need to know in order to understand that? So maybe that's an important issue to settle, to find out why did Harvard open up its doors to this African American? Why did they do it? Right. So that's an important question to know in order to understand that. Mhm.
But following up on her question, was he the only African American that was uh, admitted at that time?
Talking about the first African American to get a PhD from Harvard.
Okay.
Right. That's what the quote is saying. He was the first African American to get a PhD from Harvard. So the question that was asked earlier on about what the intentions of Harvard University were, that's an important question. Maybe we need to know that. Yes.
Well, I'm saying it's the politics of the time. Sometimes the institution for themselves, they will not have wanted that. But because the politics of the time are demanding change, So, I mean, we have this with what is Black Tonton in South Africa. Most of white companies don't want Black people there. But the politics of the time, they have to have a first Black person in the company. And then, because the times are forcing that Harvard must have him.
Can you formulate that as a question, not as an explanation, but as a question? What would be the question there?
What were the politics of the time that allowed Harvard to have him there?
You know, I'm insisting on this because I think we have this social science habit, all of us, of moving too quickly to answers. We move too quickly to answers as social scientists, and that's a bad habit, a bad intellectual habit. So, you know, maybe even if you think you know, even if you think you're reasonably sure about something, try to formulate it as a question. Right? Try to formulate it as a question. Because as you do that, you might realize that there's something you're not taking into account. You might. You might not. Right?
Okay, thank you. I think it will still take me back to what I have said. Looking at it, we look at it from a two-coin perspective. One, if it is now, and if it was at that time. So, what I should know that I did not know about this, which will allow me maybe to speak based on the context of the statement, is one, how did he got the admission to the university as the first black? How did he get the admission? And whether he got the admission through his qualification or he got the admission through, Harvard standing up to say that, okay, we want to show out that Black Americans can also do it. So if it based on that, I can say that is why he has to give that honor back to the institution. Two, what was the politics or the educational policies at that time when he was being enrolled into the university? What were the things that he was passing through? If it is based on that, which I did not know, then we'll say that he's showing his, sorry to use this word, maybe he's trying to project himself to say that it is an honor for Harvard to have me as a black man or a first black man to come out with a PhD, if that was the context. And probably three, what I will not know, what I did not know, is that was he maybe did the occasion at which the statement was said, was it in the when he was graduating from this thing or convocation or any other thing, or was he writing a book? What motivated him to say that at that occasion? So these three things, if I know, then I will be able to say, okay, this is my verdict on his opinion. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes.
Pour moi, il y a également une connotation positive dans cette affirmation de Webb Dubois. Peut-être qu'à l'époque, c'était une étape d'émancipation des intellectuels noirs, d'où l'acceptation, son admission à l'université d'Harvard. Et c'est à travers cette admission-là qu'il a démontré sa capacité de faire. Il a démontré à travers sa volonté que nous aussi, nous pouvons le faire. Donc, ce n'est pas seulement une cause de racisme pour moi. Peut-être qu'à travers cette affirmation, on voit aussi que malgré toutes les difficultés, toutes les expériences négatives que les Noirs ont traversées dans le monde, surtout aux États-Unis, à travers le racisme, ils ont pu transcender ces difficultés-là et ils ont montré à travers l'acceptation des autres, notre capacité de faire. Et grâce à notre volonté de traverser toutes les difficultés et de réussir. Pour moi, ce n'est pas seulement la connotation négative.
Thank you. Let's approach it in a slightly different manner. Would you see a difference between someone saying this under these circumstances? So the first African American to get a PhD from Harvard, and the first person to be freed from slavery in America. Suppose he's not saying the honor, I assure you, was Harvard. He is saying the honor, I assure you, was the plantation's honor. Sometimes you need to ask questions that will give people pause to think. Yes.
In that case, I would think he was being sarcastic.
Only sarcastic?
Good morning, everyone. I'm not sure. I cannot divorce this code from who Dubois went on to be and the kinds of writings that he pioneered. My first instinct when I saw this, I said, yes, there's chutzpah, there's swag, that being the only one in that picture, and still coming out and perhaps coming out in his own terms more than the terms of Harvard would have elicited. For me, it was as if somebody said to him, are you honored to have come out with a PhD from Harvard as a first Black man? And him being who he then went on to be, he said, no, of course, the honor is all theirs. Because if he went on to write the way he did when he was saying things like, the souls of Black folk, which he went on to dissect in such minute terms and to understand whiteness in relation, then he was almost asserting himself as his own man. He was asserting himself as a human being in the first place. And I think the statement you made to say that he already, I think it was Florence who was saying, he already had his own, personal makeup that added to a one-sided class of people who thought alike. And so this contribution that he could make then was able to bring a robustness that was not always going to be possible had it been a class of all white males. So of course, the times also do matter, and the times might also have given him reason to say, of course, the honor is all Harvard's, because he was an activist. And I would like to say his activism, inflected all aspects of his life. So that was my first instinct, that he walked with swag. He walked with three eyes. He had eyes in front and eyes at the back, and he could see through, and that became the mainstay and the mark of his work. So he was not putting himself down and self-erasing and self-effacing, which was perhaps the way of the enslaved. They were not slaves, they were enslaved. Which was the way of the enslaved. And he was asserting a different kind of black man who says, I see you, I know you for who you are, and I know myself even better. And when in conversation, I would say that you are better off having had me than I am for having had you, because like I say, I think he went on to show that he's got these proverbial three eyes that are able to pierce through and really speak to things in complex ways that is not always possible for everyone. Yes.
I am in complete agreement with Prof. I think that was my first reaction when I saw it, but I suspect I am coming from it with hindsight. Now that I know Du Bois and I know what he's achieved, the honor is Harvard's for me. There's a whole institution at Harvard named after him. There are scholarships in his name. He brought us the concept of the double consciousness, and Harvard boasts about him. So when I read this, I thought he's right. He has the foresight. He knew that the honor was theirs. They were blessed to have him. So in a sense, I agree with you, Prof, that the swag was there and he knew it.
Thank you.
Et même si l'honneur revient à Harvard, il s'est également distingué des autres. Parce que peut-être qu'il n'était pas le seul noir dans cette université, mais lui, il a été le premier à se distinguer des autres noirs à travers ses forces intellectuelles. Donc moi, je trouve que tout ne tourne pas autour de l'honneur uniquement. Tout tourne également autour de la distinction et du mérite de cet homme-là à travers l'université d'Harvard.
Yeah.
I'm just asking myself now, since you said we must not rush to answer, because I must admit that this is one of the things that as a PhD student I struggled with. How do you ask the right question that will enable your explanation or what you want to do? So I'm thinking, was it not the birth of critical race theory? The honor is Harvard. It's like what you were saying, that there must have been someone who said this, you must be honored. We know white people to be here. So, and then he used the same thing. And Americans, Black are very good in this, the comeback. Even when you talk about Christianity, they use the same thing, and they say, but you don't even know this person is a Jewish whatever. They are very good in taking what James Baldwin, it comes out, the whole debate of how American became American. Was not America built on the backs of Black Americans? And he tolerates this white man who comes and presents, but the way he asked the question in his presentation. So for me, I think it's the birth of critical race theory.
Interesting.
And just to go back to something I think Loretta spoke about earlier, I might be misquoting him, but Du Bois did speak about how he was at Harvard, but he wasn't of it. Am I correct? He was in Harvard, but he wasn't part of Harvard. Okay, so.
I think they both persevered. Harvard, as well as him, they both persevered. I feel like he's saying, shame. They put up with me. They tolerated me, and they probably faced a lot of resistance. But at the end of the day, I got my degree, and they got a few accolades for allowing that to happen.
Thank you, Professor. Just sitting and thinking about it deeply. First of all, the courage Harvard had to take him as a Black man was commendable. But the question I think is that, did it mean that Harvard had did it mean that he opened doors for other Black people to be part of the university by saying that I assure you, it was Harvard. I mean, did it open doors? Did it challenge those who were in position of power in Harvard to say, hey, other Black people are capable of being part of the PhD journey amidst the struggles that were taking place?
Je vais revenir sur l'exercice. Qu'est-ce que nous savons, mais que nous ne savons pas? Depuis, nous tournons autour du concept honneur. Nous essayons de donner le sens connoté et le sens dénoté de ce concept-là. Mais en fait, nous nous basons sur des hypothèses que nous essayons de valider parce que nous croyons connaître, mais que nous ne connaissons vraiment pas. Nous tournons par des questions, nous essayons de comprendre, mais en conclusion, nous ne connaissons vraiment pas parce que nous n'étions pas témoins. Nous essayons juste de valider. Et je vais finir par conclure que ce que nous pensons savoir, nous ne le savons pas. D'où la recherche en sciences sociales. Nous devons nous poser des questions, essayer de trouver des réponses à ces questions-là que nous aurons peut-être et nous trouverons finalement par trouver des réponses, peut-être ou pas. Merci.
Thank you for summarizing what we're doing.
Alors, moi, j'ai une question pour le professeur. Est-ce que le professeur peut nous situer par rapport à d'où est-ce qu'il a pris l'image? C'est-à-dire, est-ce que c'est un document duquel c'est tiré? Et c'était dans quel contexte? Ce sont des éléments qui auraient pu nous aider à ne... Parce que là, depuis, nous sommes en train de supputer. Nous sommes dans une supputation. Bon, mais c'est juste un élément qu'on nous a montré, sorti de son contexte. Alors que nous savons que les images n'ont du sens que dans un contexte donné. Et même la citation. Est-ce que c'est...
Okay, thank you for that. You know, what I'm surprised about is that you're only saying that now. That's what you should have said right at the beginning. That's my point. You know, right at the beginning, you should have asked me, where did you get that? What was the context? But, you know, you just launched, and you were one of the first to speak, just launched into an explanation of what you saw there. But yes, you are right. You are right. Those are things we need to know. That's why I asked the question, what do you think you need to know in order to be able to address that statement there? So, of course, those journalistic questions, who, what, when, where, are very important, but the historical questions are also important. You see, that's why I say the life of concept. What I mean by that is that concepts acquire their meaning in life, in the way we live them, in how they describe the world for us, our everyday life, the social relations we engage in. We cannot understand what people are saying to us if we don't know anything about the life enveloping the terms that they're using to account for their experience. Right? And so I think those are very important questions. And I mean, I also want to say that I do not disagree with any of the things that were said here, right? Even if some of them contradict one another, I do not disagree with that. All I'm suggesting is that we need to be aware of the life which concepts lead. Concepts lead a life. And so context is always very important. My own reading of what Du Bois is saying here is consistent with some of the readings that were made here, which is that he is resisting naturalizing Black inferiority. Because if you want him to be proud of being the first African American to get a PhD from Harvard, you are forcing him, or you are asking him to accept the narrative of inferiority. And so he says, no, no, the honor belongs to them for doing the right thing. The honor belongs to those who at long last decided to do the right thing. So what's happening here is very, very important as far as I'm concerned, because he is giving us an opportunity to completely change the narrative of social life. We are heirs to the vocabulary of the social sciences. And what that means is that in our work, we cannot escape the normative assumptions underlying that vocabulary. Right? So what Du Bois does here is to say to us, if we want to use this terminology, if we want to be able to account for the world, we have to have the courage to change the narrative. We have to challenge the normative assumptions. That's what he's doing here. He's challenging the normative assumptions underlying the language with which we speak about human experience. Right? So he's saying, at long last, you took the decision to do the right thing. At long last. It took you so long to do that. And because you are the first to do it, the honor is yours. The honor is yours. That's why I brought in that other example. When I asked you if it had been someone who had been enslaved, who had been freed from slavery, saying that, how would that have changed our approach to that quote? Precisely in those terms. Because it's not the normal human condition to be a slave. Right? So if you say, no, it's not my honor to be the first person to be freed from slavery, it's the honor of that person who realized that that was the wrong thing to do. Okay, now what this also tells us, maybe before I move on to the next thing, and then we will have our coffee break, I just wanted to mention a Congolese scholar who was actually mentioned here by Godwin Murunga on the first day, and that's Jacques De Pelcia. Jacques De Pelcia wrote a very interesting book with the title Silences in History. Silences in History. And what he does is to try and show how historiography can actually uphold problematic narratives. It can convey problematic narratives. And so he says that it does that by basically suffering from two syndromes, which he describes as the syndrome of discovery and the syndrome of abolition. And what he means by that is that European historiography, so this is his terminology, actually approaches things as if things could only begin to exist once Europeans had put their eyes on them. That's the syndrome of discovery, right? So if there is no European account of something, that thing does not exist. And that means then that everything that you will not find in European narratives, which is relevant for, say, African historiography, it does not exist. So the second syndrome is the syndrome of abolition. when he says that, you know, things are only valid the moment, I mean, they are ethically good the moment Europeans decide not to do them. So slavery was okay until the moment Europeans said, okay, it's not okay anymore, right? And then we have to give them credit for it. And the example he uses, it's really, it's a heavy, it's really a heavy example he gives. I mean, we all know about Haiti, you know, about Toussaint Louverture, the revolution, right? But that often the people who are credited for having done away with slavery are the abolitionists in Britain and in the US, not Toussaint Louverture, who actually overthrew the slave system in Haiti. But not only that, he once told me that celebrated 200 years of the revolution. There was only one African president who participated in those celebrations, and it was Thabo Mbeki, and from South Africa. And when Britain did 200 years of abolition, all African presidents were there. Almost all African presidents were there. Yeah. So what this means to me, and this is part of the reason why I wanted us to have this discussion at some length. There's a distinction which is made in philosophy between fact and foil. What that distinction means is that usually the answers that we have are simply the content for an envelope that actually allows for more questions than just one. So sometimes we may think that the answer we have is an answer to a very specific question, but it is also a potential answer to other questions. So in social science methodology, for example, we translate that into a famous joke about a criminal, a very famous criminal in the UK who used to rob banks. And so he was caught and he was sentenced to jail. And then his priest went to see him. And when the priest went there, he asked him, "My son, why do you rob banks?" And then his answer was, "Because that's where the money is." Right? So what he understood was that the priest was asking him, "Why do you rob banks instead of schools or instead of Elysius Place?" Right? Why do you do that? So what that means is that we have a lot of answers, but we always have to ask the question, what is the question that answer is addressing? And that is why I'm always insisting with you that don't move too quickly to answers. Check the question. I mean, this is, I always thought there were a few Marxists here, and that's what Marxists do. If you don't know the answer, question the question, right? That's what you should do. So again, what we see in that example with Du Bois, he is telling them, there are more questions there than just the one you think you are asking me. So you want me to be proud of being the first African American, but the question that I see is, why did it take you so long? Why did it take you so long to do the right thing? Right? So questions are very important. And to realize the importance of questions, we need to be humble enough to always ask ourselves if there's anything we don't know and we should know in order to address something. If we don't get into the habit of asking that, it's going to be very hard to do research and to be critical. Because at the end of the day, we want to be critical. So it will be very hard to be critical. Okay. So I also wanted to sound a bit like an evangelical pastor. So, okay. So what we are going to do today, I mean, we will soon have the break, but when we come back, I want them to address the issues which I think are at stake in what we are doing today. And I think it's basically three kinds of issues that I want to raise with you in connection with concepts. The first issue is the issue of translation. I think translation is very, very important. Of course, the simple definition of translation is to say, well, it's the job of rendering something intelligible in one language into another, right? But that is quite straightforward. And so it may convey the impression that it's simple. And I want to suggest to you, or I want to impress on you that it's not that simple, right? Especially when you relate that to social science, which is what we do. Because social science is a language as well. So we use we use social science to translate, right? To translate things. Now, what happens when we do that? What happens when we translate through the work that we do as social scientists? I think one of the key issues that we need to take into account as far as that is concerned is the issue of, if you like, the cultural and normative assumptions underlying that language of social science. So how do we manage to translate social science language without undermining the meaning through the normative assumptions underlying that language? That's the problem. I keep saying that we are heirs to social science vocabulary. And social science vocabulary is something that comes to us through what we all describe as the Enlightenment project, right? But the Enlightenment project took place in one place at one specific moment in history and in response to particular challenges faced by the people who produced it, right? Now, one assumption that those people made was that through that Enlightenment project, they could speak to the universal. And the critique that has come from a lot of people, including Mudimbe, including Samir Amin, Edward Said, all sorts of people, that critique has been to suggest that we are being forced to reduce the universal to the European experience, such that when we apply that language to give an account of our realities, we are actually looking at our realities from the prism of Europe. Now, what does that mean to the quality and the validity of the knowledge that we are producing? So issues of translation have a lot to do with that. It's like we could say, well, translation is almost like commenting on things in the world from a European perspective. And that is why I find the work of Kwasi Wiredu, the Ghanaian philosopher who passed away recently, quite stimulating, especially when he talks about untranslatability, which is not to suggest that what is untranslatable is unintelligible. That's not what he is saying. He's simply saying there are assumptions underlying it, and you need to read that concept of those assumptions so that it can do the job you want it to do, right? So understanding is a crucial moment for Wiredu. And funnily enough, curiously enough, he's also saying, in order to understand, you need to come to the limits of your understanding. Yeah. So you go with the concept as far as it takes you. So you want to go to the limits of that concept. And then it's at that moment that you will make the transition. It's interesting because something similar was also said before him, before Wiredu. It was said by the Austrian philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein, when he said, "The limits of my world are the limits of my language. The limits of my world are the limits of my language." And so the thing is always that we approach social science conceptual vocabularies as if they were unproblematic, as if they were not telling the story of the limits of the world from which they came. Yeah. And finally, the other thing that I think is important here is something that was said by a French sociologist, Bruno Latour, in the context of science and technology studies. I find it stimulating, and it is the idea of black boxes. You know, the way he describes science as black boxes, that all we see is what comes out of it, but not the things in there, right? So how they interact, how they come together to produce the things that we see outside, right? And I think concepts are like black boxes. So if we want to do critical social science, we need to open up the black boxes. We need to open up the concepts and see how they are doing their work. So what I will be saying to you after the break will be based on a text which I will share with everyone here from a book that you see there, Translation Revisited. It's a book that Jean-Bernard Ouedraogo from Burkina Faso, Mamadou Diawara from Mali, and myself, we edited that book. We just focusing on the notion of translation. And I have a chapter in that book with the title Translating Black Boxes. Translating Black Boxes, where I address precisely those issues that I'm going to talk about later on. So, yeah, that's it. We're going to continue after the break. We have a 30-minute break now. So, you don't need to clap now. So, welcome back. And so let's continue with okay. So I said the issues that we need to address are issues that have to do with translation, with the specific notion of untranslatability, and with the concept of black boxes as a description of the way in which the concepts that we use conceal the processes that constituted them, the relationships that they weave into meaningful patterns, such that at the end of the day, we face the risk of using the vocabulary of the social sciences to comment on things from a particular perspective. And given that that vocabulary comes to us via the so-called Enlightenment project, then often the meanings which we are conveying are the meanings that basically express the normative assumptions underlying that vocabulary. So I raise these issues because I think that to work with concepts is actually to come to terms with all the possible and potential meanings that are entailed in the vocabulary that we use. But I thought it would be important to make a distinction, and I'm making this distinction simply for practical purposes. I'm not sure that that is a distinction which can be justified in a solid way through philosophy, through the philosophy of science. But I think it's important for our purposes here to say that we have concepts on the one hand and we have categories on the other hand. And categories are, for me, more or less what actually Aristotle is, the statements that we can make about the world, without which we would not be in a position to talk about the world. So, for example, two examples of such categories could be time and space. It's next to impossible to talk about the world without reference to time and space, for example. So I am broadening that concept of category to actually include many more things that I am going to explain. So I reserve the concept of the concept basically to the specific vocabulary that we use in the disciplines. So each discipline has got a vocabulary, and that vocabulary consists of concepts. And they have mainly to do with how we define our object or our object of research in our disciplines, and the kinds of concepts that we need to address that object. So I would be using the concept categories because I think it's much more appropriate to the kind of discussion that I want to promote here. Maybe at the end of the day, we will come to the conclusion that it's preferable to use concept and not category. But for the purpose of the exercise we are doing in this summer school, I think we will have achieved a lot if through reflection and debate, we come to, well, to do away with the distinction that I am making now. So my point of departure, as far as categories are concerned, is that we can think of them in three ways, right? So I think categories can be conceptual. And when we say that categories are conceptual, we are basically saying that what we can name is knowable. That is, we can know what we are naming. And of course, what is knowable within a framework of intelligibility. So when we say that categories are conceptual, we are making the claim that if we can name something, we can know it. I will come back to that because there are a few more things I need to say about conceptual categories. The second type of categories I have in mind is descriptive. So categories can be descriptive. And what that means is basically that what I can know by applying certain procedures to know it. So it's almost like I'm saying what I can know has got properties that somehow can be matched to my ability to know. And again, I'll come back to that in more detail. And finally, categories can also be analytical. That means to say what I can know can be translated into data and therefore into things that can be broken down into constituent parts. And again, I'll come back to that in more detail in a minute. So you can also see here why I prefer to use the notion of category and not of concept, so that I can use the adjective conceptual to describe a very particular way of thinking about knowing. So a very particular way of using categories. Let me speak a little bit about conceptual categories. Conceptual categories are basically tools which enable us to establish essential features of the world. So the world for us is the social world, of course. It's not necessarily the natural world. So the world is the object of our discipline, right? So we use conceptual categories to basically establish those essential features of the world. What that means is that we place ourselves in a position to discover new things about the world or to confirm the existence of things that we think are out there in the world. That's what we use conceptual categories for. Yeah. So there's a British philosopher called Peter Winch who did a lot of methodology of the social sciences. And he once used the example of the germ theory of disease. And he said, that could be seen as a good example of a conceptual category. Or what I mean by a conceptual category. He didn't use that terminology that I am using. So, disease has always been with us, right? But we have different ways of accounting for disease, right? We knew there was disease, we knew that someone is ill, but we didn't know how to account for it, or we had different ways of accounting for it. And then people discovered that there are things in the world called germs which can cause disease. And that produced the germ theory of disease. So it was almost like people discovered an essential feature of the world, a new thing in the world, right? And so that is a conceptual discovery, right? Now, later on, if we find a germ that explains, I don't know, malaria or explains tuberculosis or explains some other disease, we are no longer discovering, we're no longer making a conceptual discovery. We are just expanding on our knowledge, right? We're just expanding on our knowledge. So that is the importance of conceptual categories. And of course, the challenge is often that some of the vocabulary that we use from the social sciences can be treated or tends to be treated as if they were conceptual categories. We've had a lot of those. I think in our case, in the African case, take for example, the concept of primitive society. The concept of primitive society, which some people approached as a conceptual category, right? So in the 19th century, when legal scholars in Europe and in the US were trying to explain where the state as an institution came from, they came up with the idea that there had been an evolution, and that evolution had started from a primitive state. So the moment they came up with that idea of a primitive society, they could claim to have made a conceptual discovery, as a function of which they could then go about giving accounts of different societies in the world. Right? So I think conceptual categories are very important because they also tend to be constitutive of our disciplines. Almost every discipline has got constitutive conceptual categories. I mean, societies are constitutive conceptual category for sociology, for example. Social transformation is a conceptual category for sociology. You know, so you can also think of conceptual categories almost like theoretical frameworks because they are directing your attention to how you should look at things and to how you should feel things with content. Right? So conceptual categories. We've also got descriptive categories. And descriptive categories are now different in the sense that the job which they do is not to discover new things in the world, it's not to establish essential features of the world. What they do is to suggest that the things out there have got properties which can be identified in discursive ways, right? So through the deployment of discourse, that is, we can speak meaningfully about the world. And then I think this refers basically to our ability to define concepts, right? And so I want to refer to one particular way of defining concepts to elaborate on the idea of a descriptive category. So one basic way that we employ to define concepts is to make a distinction between what philosophers call extension and intention. Extension and intention. What do they mean by that? They mean that concepts, terms, words have always got two kinds of references. So one reference is to what actually exists in the world. So one reference is to classes of things, right? What Descartes called res extensa. So the world, space, what there is out there. But the other reference that concepts have, that words or terms have, is the attributes or the features of that thing that's being described. Right? So I can give an example. I can say, take the concept of the dog. The dog. So it's got an extensive dimension, right? And that extensive dimension refers to all the dogs that exist in the world. No? So the class of things which we describe as dogs, as canine, as it were. Yeah? Whereas the dimension of intention of the term dog refers to the attributes of the dog. So what are the attributes of the dog? Well, dogs bark. Dogs have got paws. Dogs bite. Dogs have got hair, and so on. Right? Now, the importance of this is that actually in the social sciences, we work a lot with descriptive categories. And often when we put descriptive categories to work, what we are doing is actually looking for the attribute within a particular concept which we think can help us account for something. So I think yesterday someone said, since there are so many people and we are sitting so far apart from one another, it's very difficult for me to get to know the names of everyone. So I'm sorry about this. If this had been a cozier setup, this would not have happened. But the Ethiopian colleague, the other Ethiopian colleague yesterday on my left hand side, she said something about women. She said women are not just women, right? So women are maybe urban, maybe they belong to elites, maybe they have got higher education, and so on and so on. Now, what she was doing was actually looking at the concept of women as a descriptive category and looking at its intentional features. So we have women as extension, that is all the women in the world, right? But women as intention, that is the attributes which all the women in the world can have. So a woman is not just a woman. A woman has got a certain educational background. A woman is married or unmarried. A woman is old or young. A woman is a professional or not. A woman is urban or rural, and so on. Yeah. So often, when we do research, let us say we are doing research on women or on aspect pertaining to women. For example, just a simple example. If I were to say, I want to study how women voted in the recent Kenyan elections. There were elections in Kenya. So I want to know how women voted in the recent Kenyan elections. I cannot do that without breaking down the concept of woman into its intentional features. Because what I'm going to find out is not that women voted for the candidate who won. I'm going to find out that women with this and that attribute voted for the candidate who won. And women with these attributes did not vote for that candidate, for example. Right? So we use descriptive categories actually to make distinctions at the level of attributes, at the level of features. Right? So often when we say, oh, you are making a sweeping statement, you are making a generalization, we are complaining about people using a concept at the level of extension and not at the level of intention. So when we say Africa is not a country, right, we are saying it's important to make distinctions when you use the concept of Africa, because Africa has got several features. For example, that Africa is Senegal, Nigeria, Malawi, and so on. That Africa is north, south, west, central. That Africa is Muslim, Christian, African religion. That Africa is this and that, is democracy, not a democracy, authoritarian, and so on. Yeah. So when we say Africa is not a country, we are saying you are using that descriptive category simply at the level of extension, at the level of classes, but you should go down. Yeah. So descriptive categories are important in that sense because they allow us to make distinctions and therefore also to produce better descriptions of things. That's why it's called descriptive category. You know, we can then make, right. It's interesting to note that often when we do our research, we are not sufficiently aware of these things, right? When we do our research. So we take a concept and, you know, we just deploy it. Remember what I said on the first day when I said, you know, we use the concept of Africa as if it meant the same thing to all of us. We use the concept of corruption as if it meant the same thing to all of us. That's precisely what I meant. That actually each one of us, when they approach a concept, they are focusing on certain attributes. And that's why we come to have different understandings of the same concept that we are using. So when I do my methodology classes, I usually focus a lot on this because I think it's crucially important. So I give examples like, you know, suppose somebody were to produce a study that showed that men cause a lot of accidents in a particular city, right? And so one conclusion that one could draw from a study like that would be to say men can't drive. You know, so you would make a generalization. Men can drive. If they are involved in so many accidents, they can't drive. But then if you go and you look at the data, you might find out that actually 80% of the accidents caused by men were caused by men between the ages of 18 and 25. Now, if you know that, it would be irresponsible to say men can't drive. You should actually say, well, men between the ages of 18 and 25 can't drive. I mean, it's not a good statement, but you could say it like that, more or less. But then if you looked again at the data, you might find that 60% of those men who cause us accidents between the ages of 18 and 25, right, they are from a certain social class, right? So they are the children of, you know, the political elites. So you shouldn't say man can't drive, right? You shouldn't even say man between the ages of can't drive, but maybe, you know, men between the ages of who have got this social background can't drive. You see, you've specified that more. But then you could also look at the data again and you find out that 80% of those 60% took their driving lessons at Sandra Brown's driving school, right? So there, maybe what you should say is that, well, it's men of that age with that social background who took their driving lesson at that school who can't drive. And every time you make these specifications, you are getting a better understanding of what you are looking at. You are making your description of the thing richer. So that's what descriptive categories do, or that is what descriptive categories allow us to do. Okay. So I'll move on now from descriptive categories to analytical categories. So what are analytical categories as far as I'm concerned? So this is all my terminology. Well, analytical categories are the categories that we need in order to break down our data into constituent parts, into their constituent parts, right? So the focus here with analytical categories is no longer with description, but with data, right? So descriptive categories allow us to organize our observations of the world, and analytical categories allow us to organize our data, right? So part of what I was doing when I gave the example, the driving example, is part of what you can do when you approach your data. Yeah. And this is quite interesting, or I mean, not quite. It's very, very important, right? Because, okay, I'll make a generalization here. I have the feeling that a considerable part of social science research. Oh, I can hear myself. I've just realized how lucky you are because my voice sounds good. Okay. So, I realized that part of, or considerable part of social science research does not do analysis. It only does interpretation. People collect data and then they interpret data, but they don't analyze data. And that might also explain why we are so fond of explaining, moving straight to explanation, because we don't analyze our data, right? We don't analyze our data. And analyzing data means what? That you do all those questionnaires, maybe you transcribe them, and then you sit down and you look at that. You say, okay, so what are the constituent parts of this? What are they? So we code, typically, we code. We do the coding, right? And coding means, well, first of all, you identify the constituent parts, what your data made of, right? And then you reconstitute it in theoretically meaningful ways. A simple example of analysis is water. To analyze water is to establish that it consists of two molecules, hydrogen and oxygen in specific combinations, right? So, that's analysis. It's a Greek word that means, breaking apart. Yeah. So if you go to the doctor and they are not sure about what you have, they take your blood or your urine, right? And they analyze it. What do they mean when they say they are analyzing your blood or your urine? They are checking whether your blood consists of those molecules that are expected, for blood. Then if they find there's something that shouldn't be there, they know where the problem is. or if they find that the quantities are not those that should be there, then they know what the problem is. You know, so often in social science, we just collect the blood, don't look at it, and draw conclusions. That's what we do. I mean, we go through the trouble of collecting the blood. We do that, but then we ignore it, and we draw conclusions. Then we say this is capitalism, exploitation, and oppression, and so on. Yeah. So that is what analytical categories enable us to do. You know, to approach our data, to organize our data, to break down our data into constituent parts, and then put our data together in meaningful ways. And those meaningful ways are, of course, theoretical ways. So we will do that as a function of our theoretical approach. So if we are taking a political economy perspective, which is Marxist, you know, then that lens that we are going to use to put our data together so that our data can start speaking, or our data speak. So this is it. I think so. What I'm suggesting to you is that the language that we use requires certain distinctions that can help us engage critically with knowledge, with the knowledge claims that people make. And we do that critical engagement by paying particular attention to the descriptive nature of categories, to the conceptual nature of categories, but also to the analytical nature of categories. And that we can only be, if you like, satisfied with the critical engagement that we are making if we have inquired into all those levels, right? And if we have made the relevant distinctions, you know, at that level, right? Now, this has got serious implications to our question concerning how political knowledge is. It has serious implications. And those implications have to do with the nature of concepts as black boxes. Again, I'm referring here to the work of the French sociologist Bruno Latour, who claims that the way science works is by concealing the processes that constitute it. So I'm suggesting also that concepts have that quality as well. They are objects, or they are tools that conceal, you know, the processes that constituted them. I think, you know, this German politician of the 19th century, Otto Bismarck, you know, once said, politics is like sausage. You don't want to know what went into making them, right? So it's the same with concepts. They are like sausages, right? You don't know what went into there. Yeah. But to be a critical scholar means having an interest in knowing what went into the concepts that you use, right? And so, you know, we need to unpack, we need to open the black box. And I think what we find in those black boxes that we use as concepts are three things. The first thing, which owes to the legacy of the Enlightenment project that produced the conceptual vocabularies that we use, is the conflation of Europe and the universal, right? So the whole idea that reason is paramount, and I think that's an acceptable statement. I think we can accept that statement within certain bounds, has led people to assume that the accounts of the world which they were giving at a particular time were not simply local accounts, but accounts of the whole world, right? So if you want to know the world, the real world, this is the vocabulary that you have to use. Yeah. And so this is, that point where a lot of critical inquiry has come from outside of Europe. So when you think about approaches like, can the subaltern speak? Post-colonialism, decoloniality, the coloniality of knowledge, and so on and so on. Even feminist scholarship. What people are saying is basically that we need to challenge the assumption that there is an elective affinity between Europe and the universal. So when Chakrabarti once Dipesh Chakrabarti once said, we need to provincialize Europe, this is what he meant. That Europe is local. Europe is local. So provincializing Europe means acknowledging its local nature. Now, this is not to suggest that out of a local experience, you cannot say meaningful things about the world. Not at all. So there are things that you can say about the world. I think it would be a mistake to assume that the only possible conversation is the local one. Because we always have the ambition to say something meaningful, not only to us, but to others. So how can we entertain that ambition if we insist, right, on the sovereignty of the local? And how can a conversation be possible then if we insist on that? And this is where, again, I hope you are realizing this. This is where, again, this issue of objectivity comes back to haunt us. Because it's all very well to say, and we should say it, that, the claims to objectivity of science, we should take that with a pinch of salt, yes. But then, on what grounds should people agree with us? Accept what we are saying? If not on grounds that are beyond local in some way. In some way. But of course, this is not as straightforward as I'm making it to sound. So my work now is on something that I call, I'm working on the notion of radical silence. And that comes from my discomfort from, because, for being understood by the people I'm criticizing. I feel uncomfortable about that. So I sit there wondering whether I'm really saying something that challenges things, if they can understand me so easily. So the conclusion I've drawn from that is to withdraw into a radical silence. I mean, I could have said to withdraw into silence, but that's not sexy intellectually. So I had to say radical. Right. Oh, okay. Again. I mean, actually, before we came here, I told him to record laughter so that, like they do on television. Right. So radical silence, I mean, of course, it's not just about being sexy. It's also about saying it's an active form of silence. It's a silence that challenges our claims to understanding one another and the terms by which we understand one another. Right. But that's a very complicated issue, I know. But it's simply to say that the concepts which we use are black boxes, and those black boxes contain within themselves this highly problematic assumption that you can conflate Europe with the universal, and that working with concepts means addressing that particular problem. And I have no idea, or I don't want to suggest the outcome of that. I don't want to say here that if you do it properly, at the end of the day, this is what you're going to have. I'm just stating the problem. The second thing about black boxing is it's actually a stimulating kind of idea, and it is the relationship between the present, that is what we have today, right, and history, but history in the sense of contingency. So I was talking a little bit about this yesterday. When we look at the world today and we use social science vocabulary, the impression that it conveys to us, that social science vocabulary, is that this world could not have been otherwise. So back many centuries ago, the German philosopher Leibniz said, we live in the best of all possible worlds. That was in the 18th century. Yeah, we live in the best of all possible worlds. So it's this idea that if you do things right, this is the kind of world you're going to end up with. Yeah. So the state of Africa today is probably the outcome of not doing things right. So you use this language to describe what is not normal. Yeah. And that is why a lot of our research in sociology, perhaps less so in anthropology, but definitely in political science, in economics, and so on, it's research about everything that is wrong about us. It's research about everything that's wrong about us. Yeah. So we use social science vocabulary in normative ways. Yeah. In normative ways. So here, that question that we are grappling with in this summer school comes back. How political is knowledge? So maybe one answer that we could give is that knowledge is political if we do not critically engage with the normative assumptions of the concepts that we deploy. If we don't do that, then the knowledge we are going to produce is likely to be political. So actually, there's a sense in which it's not possible to do research in Africa without being critical. It's just not possible. No. And this does not mean that we have to give up the standards of science. We should give up methodology, we should give up objectivity. No, it just means we should take everything that we do with a pinch of salt. That's all it means. So that's the second thing. Now, the third element of black boxing that I also wanted to share with you is what I see as a tension between what linguists describe as procedural knowledge and propositional knowledge. So propositional knowledge would more or less correspond to what I was saying about conceptual categories. So propositional knowledge is about making discoveries about the world, about the social world. So basically going out to find out what there is out there. Or if you want to take the other perspective, going out to create or to produce new things. Whereas procedural knowledge is knowledge that basically comes to us through how we deploy particular techniques to produce knowledge. How we deploy particular techniques to produce knowledge. So the famous philosopher from Benin, Paulin Untonji, one of the things that made him famous was his suggestion that there is an intellectual division, or there's an international division of intellectual labor, where Africans collect data and non-Africans theorize and interpret data produced by Europeans. Yeah, that's the international intellectual division of labor. Yeah, I think you can express that using the terminology I'm suggesting here of propositional and procedural knowledge. So we do that, what Utonji is criticizing, we do that when we simply focus on procedure. When we are not concerned with theory. And remember what I said the other day, when we are not concerned with finding out how relevant the knowledge we produce in Africa is to understanding things in Germany, in France, in the US. Every time we fail to have that ambition, we are committing ourselves to procedural knowledge. Right? And so that also explains a bit the exercise we did with Proverbs. There is a stock of knowledge. I mean, we like to say there's local, we have local knowledge, vernacular knowledge, and so on, but we don't actually do it. We don't do it. Right? So there's a problem with carrying out research only concentrating on procedural knowledge and not on propositional knowledge. And again, that is something that comes our way through these black boxes that we call concepts, right? Because we fail to appreciate the extent to which those concepts actually reflect a critical engagement that people carried out, with the concepts that they are using, as far as the procedural side of things is concerned and the propositional side of things is concerned. So some of the best work done by, say, African scholars, the most stimulating intellectual work done by African scholars has consisted in going beyond the procedural knowledge and moving into propositional knowledge. When somebody like Valentin Mudimbe looks at the concept of Africa and how it came into being and how it came to have this representational quality, which is functional to the reproduction of the power of Europe over us, which is pretty much what Edward Said said about the Orientalism. And then Mudimbe says there's a colonial library. There's a colonial library. And so the knowledge of Africa comes from that library. So he's moved from procedure to proposition. And he's saying to us, look, maybe we think we're producing knowledge, but we're not. We're just going to that library to pick up things, to pick up books, and then present those books as the revelation of reality. When somebody like Samir Amin, whether we agree with that or not, but when Samir Amin says we have to delink, right? He's going beyond Marxism. He's going beyond Marxism. So he's going beyond procedure to proposition. Yeah. So it's that kind of thing that's being suggested here. That we are dealing with black boxes. So to do research, to critically engage with knowledge production, is to open up those boxes and see what's in there and see how the things which are there in there relate to one another and how they are concocted, how they form into shapes, into things that we then recognize outside here as sausages, right? As sausages. So in the article where in that chapter I referred to earlier on, I give an example of how you can do this. And the example which I give is the concept of democracy. I look at the concept of democracy and how we apply it in Africa. And what I try to show is how the concept of democracy should be viewed not simply as the outcome, but as a contingent outcome of historical processes. And that failure to look at the concept of development as a contingent outcome is partly responsible for our inability to account for what we have politically today. Our failure to understand political systems in Africa may be related to that particular thing. So in terms of what I don't know, and actually I should know in order to do political sociology, is actually, to engage critically with the concept of democracy. How should I use the concept of democracy to explain things in Africa? Because a lot of us, myself included, simply use that concept in a normative way. you know. So we approach things, political things in Africa, using the concept of democracy. And what it does with us is to encourage us to look for what's not working, what's at fault, what's lacking, and so on. And I am not sure that's the best way to work with that concept. Rather, I'm not sure that by working with that concept in that way, I will be able to achieve my research objectives. Yeah. So that's so that's one thing that I do to illustrate what I mean by opening up the black box. You know, but it's also, you know, allowed me, for example, to see how recent democracy is in Europe, because somehow you get the impression that Europe has always been democratic. You know, and then I look and I see up until the first European war, there were only 3 republics in the world, in the European world. You know, Portugal was a republic, Switzerland was a republic, sorry, yeah, and France. Everything else all around, everything else were monarchies. You know, and then you look and you see, well, not everybody could vote. Not everybody. In Switzerland, in some cantons of Switzerland, only in the 70s did women get the right to vote. I mean, in America, it was partly thanks to the civil rights movement that women got the vote. And that was in the 60s. Now, you wouldn't know this if you just took that concept for granted. You wouldn't know this. So you need to open up that black box. Now, equipped with that knowledge, I approach African politics in a different way. Not with that impatience, you know, that things should be the right way, but I just look at African politics with an open mind. You know, I acknowledge the difficulties. I worry about, you know, the lack of respect for rights, for individual rights, for, you know, freedom of expression and so on. I acknowledge all of that. But I also, you know, look at the openness of history. You know, history is an open process. And so I restrain myself, you know, I resist the temptation that is typical of us social scientists to judge and not to analyze. We judge. We don't analyze. Just go out there and judge. Yeah. Right. Do you want to say anything? No.
Thank you. I just want to ask, when you do the black box, I feel like even though we agree with decoloniality as Black scholars, and we agree with what we need to do, the way we approach, I don't know if I should say the black box. Ramos, as you know, Ramos, we will have classes with him on African philosophy. But Ramos does something that not other African scholars want to do when they open up this critical thinking. Ramos will give us, let's say, Plato to read. And then, but his whole class is about African theology. And then he gives us these tools that you are able to open them, so that when you are there with the people, you are able to even disprove how illogical this theory that has been made universal. You know, but then the African scholars who want to disengage in the sense that they want to write about, let's say, we talk about democracy. What does democracy mean in Africa? And then they write about that. And I don't think there's maybe either or, but how do we come? I don't know how to say it. Invention of Africa, for me, feels like Mudimbi sort of like pulled back and looked at this thing as it is. And then he was able, I don't know. So how do we come into this black box you are talking about and being able to pull it apart?
Yeah, no, that's a very good question. I think it has to do with several things. The first thing is the following. Knowledge today is that which we can know through the use of scientific methods, right? Whether we agree with that or not, with that state of affairs is a different matter. What counts as knowledge is largely determined by that. Now, that does not mean that we do not acknowledge other forms of knowledge, but we, by virtue of the fact that we are trained at university and so on, we implicitly make that claim. So, we need to know the nature of that knowledge. We cannot ignore Plato if we are doing philosophy. We cannot ignore Kant if we are doing philosophy. We cannot ignore Marx if we are doing social science and philosophy and history. We cannot ignore all of those people. We have to engage with them. We have to know what they said and then take things from there. So that's the first thing. Because, of course, some people who are more radical than others might actually question even the legitimacy of getting to know the canon. Yeah, they might question that. And I think that's foolish, especially if it's someone who's already learned that and is denying other people that learning. That's a problem. Yeah. So there's that element. Now the second thing, take Mudimbe, or you can take, for that matter, uh, you can take Edward Said, or for that matter, you can take Walter Mignolo. I mean, what they wrote. So Mudimbe, The Invention of Africa; Edward Said, Orientalism; Walter Mignolo, The Idea of Latin America. Right? If you take their work, that is not possible without a reference to Michel Foucault. So I cannot tell my students, read Mudimbe but don't read Foucault, because he's a dead white male. No. And look at what they did with him. And look at how they improved on his thought. That's what you have to look at. Yeah. back? Okay. Let's continue. So I'm sorry about this technical interruption, but we are good to continue. So I was still replying to the question concerning how we do this uncovering of the black box. And so the first answer was that, or the first point in the answer was that we don't need to disown the knowledge that constituted us as scholars. We need to engage with it. We accept it. And I think it's a sign of modesty to do that because, it's often that knowledge that gives us the legitimacy to confer legitimacy to other forms of knowledge. Yeah. Well, often by simply using our academic authority to say that local knowledge is valid knowledge. We are using our academic authority to do that. And that kind of knowledge could react the way that Du Bois reacted to Harvard. They could say, I don't need you to say that I'm knowledge. Come back, learn me, and let me give you my authority for you to speak on my behalf. When Amilcar Cabral, the Guinean and Cape Verdean freedom fighter, who was also an intellectual, when he reacted to negritude by saying, look, the people don't need to go back to their roots. They've never left their roots. You need to go back. You, the intellectual, you go back. If you want to speak on their behalf, go back and learn their language and speak from within, from within and not from outside. So I think this modesty is very important. Um, a lot of people. So Cabral was one of the persons who really turned the position of the African intellectual into a problem. Mhm.
On that basis, then, I don't understand why it is that we need the weight of our academic.
So that's the point I'm making. That we need to realize that our authority comes mainly from social science. This is the language we're using to speak, and I don't think we should disown it. We should accept it and move on with it, but it does not give us the authority to speak on behalf of others. Or when we do that, we have to be aware of the position from which we're speaking. And we have to be transparent about it. We have to say it. Mhm.
To just give an example, with my research on forgiveness and Desmond Tutu, I wanted to critique him, and I wanted to prove also part of it that what he says is Ubuntu is actually Christianization of Ubuntu. So therefore, I have a whole chapter 2 on Western discourses on forgiveness, so that I can show how Western his conceptualization of forgiveness. So I had to read, from Plato, Aristotle, this whole notion of what God does, we must do. And my argument therefore was like, but African spirituality doesn't say what God does do. We don't even know if God cares about that actually, but what we do, the living dead, the living, and those who are yet to come, that's what is important. But I had to go to read, and I even read the Stoics to even argue that even the Christian conceptualization of forgiveness is based on Stoicism, which is actually Western culture. And Ramos helped me with this to say, go beyond, go and read them so that when you sit there, you can show how uncritical they are in the approach of forgiveness, using even that. So it helped me to arrive at my decolonial approach into Desmond Tutu's work and to disprove him that he didn't even realize that he's operating in a Western kind of notion of Ubuntu.
I think my discomfort had to do with the word academic authority. We need our academic authority to, I don't know, because if we are looking at the basis upon this authority is predicated, then, and we are saying that perhaps when we provincialize the basis of this academic authority, then we understand that in fact our knowledge is a fraction of what is possible. A tiny distorted fraction. If we are saying that even the knowledge that we have imbibed is a distortion of some other knowledge, then I think we should be very humble about any claims to authority that comes with the kind of knowledge and standing that we have, to the extent then that we are saying that we are unthinking that which we have been taking for granted precisely because of its problematics. and a real education perhaps does lie outside of this so-called authority that we are supposed to now bring to the table. So when I introduced myself, I said, at this point in my life journey, I'm learning of the university, and I have come to realize how very tiny the knowledge that I have is in relation to the so-called uneducated people whose philosophies do not come from elsewhere, that are homegrown, and because of that, they are in their very chromosomes, in their very blood. Unlike me, always speaking through Plato and other people that had no regard for me. So I think really my discomfort had to do with, number one, we have to accept it, because I don't know if acceptance is what we want to do when we are on our way to unthinking it and reclaiming ourselves as a political stance, to say that in fact the honor was that of the university, because I do come formed already. When I come to the university, it's not as if I came blank. I came formed, and I always say the very knowledge that communities, bearing in mind that we are also a community. When we say communities, we forget that we are also a community of some sort. The knowledge that communities have has sustained them against odds, great odds. And it's a kind of knowledge that has not been as violent as the knowledge that we have been convinced to imbibe. So I think the humility that I'm really advocating for is not, I think what Minolo says is the humility of the humiliated, who come to Western knowledge with this notion that we come from a defeated people with no knowledge. I think the humility that I'm advocating is to say the knowledge that has given me the accolades that I have is nothing compared to the knowledge that I possibly did suckle from my mother's breast, that I possibly did learn from my grandmother's lap, and which I did, learn before I got to the university. So I think I wanted to turn this idea of academic authority on its tail for the kinds of entrenchment, I think, in coloniality that I perceive. So
Can I just ask a question? True that our people actually don't engage also with this knowledge. For example, a simple saying: you come to the village, you are having a glass of wine, a big car, they call you umlungu, like a white person, meaning even themselves, like us as scholars here, they are engaging actually with this knowledge and saying it's nonsensical or whatever they are saying. But when they ask, like, for example, remember in the struggle when he says, our people said, if, like what Prof said now, he's doing research on the radical silencing, if a white person agrees with it, you must know there's something wrong with it. They are also engaging it, but they might not be engaging it in the way with Plato we are engaging in the university, but they are engaging them. The songs. Yes.
They are coming to you through themselves.
Yes. Yes, so I agree with that. It doesn't mean when I read Western discourses, I am engaging through Plato, but I want to disprove it for myself and show my other colleagues would think that they are so, that actually there's discrepancies with this argument. If you look at it in its originality, also itself, and to just simplify for people that this concept is not a hard concept that comes, our people are doing it. You simplify it and you rubbish it, and you show it. It's actually nonsense to think it's universal.
Okay. Well, I mean, I think this is one of the purposes of this summer school, to raise these issues. And my position on them is that they're difficult issues, and I respect every possible position on this. I respect it. My own approach to this is that I cannot disown my training, the academic training I have, and what that creates in me is a basic suspicion about anything that I say myself, because I have no certainty that what I say is born out of my upbringing as a Tonga boy somewhere in Mozambique, or my training at school, and at my training in sociology and so on. So there's that. What Caribbean scholars talk about as processes of creolization. I'm probably a product of that, and so I'm always reticent about how representative my voice is, of my position as an African scholar. Now that is also because it's not like this science and the scientific approach defines fully the European, because they too have that relationship. Science is a very particular enterprise, so which is in confrontation with everyday life in Europe. I lived so many years in Germany, and I see that at every level, that the German that kids speak at home is not the German that's taught at school. So they go to school and they learn a completely new world. So often this conflation of science with Europe can be problematic, because it's a very specific activity. And then, we can draw from people like Marx, and we are comfortable doing that. Why? Because he's been critical. And we recognize that criticism. Mudimbe and Said can draw from Michel Foucault. Why? Because they recognize, how critical that particular perspective can be. And so they run with it. So I think, this idea of being humble is very important in all sorts of ways. So humble in terms of acknowledging my intellectual debt to the university, but also humble in acknowledging my intellectual debt to my, life in Mozambique. I mean, look, we are doing this summer school in English and French. I'm doing this summer school in English and French. How sure are we that we are seeing everything that we could say? That we are reaching the depth of all the possible meanings that there are there? How sure are we? This literature Nobel Prize winner from Zanzibar, but he wrote in English. So how much richer could his literature have been if he had written in Kiswahili? So there are all these things. Every day kids go to school in Mozambique, right? And we even have the problem now that they don't have the command of their mother tongue and they don't have the command of the official language. And they go to school. How many of us write good papers, linguistically good papers? I can't write anything without asking somebody to go through it, not even in Portuguese. That is the official language of Mozambique. So what I'm saying is that there are very, very difficult issues there that we need to confront. It's not easy. It's not easy. Yeah. It's not easy. And so, when I mentioned Cabral, I was basically drawing attention to the uncomfortable position of the intellectual. The intellectual and the right that we have to speak on behalf of anyone. It's problematic. It's challenging. I mean, in African, in the practice of philosophy in Africa, so this is what my PhD was about. I did a study in the sociology of knowledge by looking at the debate on whether there is an African philosophy or not. Right? And there you had different positions. So you had people who called themselves conceptual pragmatists, so people like Guiredo and so on, who would make claims like, well, there is no such thing as African philosophy. There is the practice of philosophy in Africa. Right? But you also had people like from Kenya, Odera Oruka, who said, no, if we want to do African philosophy, we have to look for sages in African societies and talk to them. And then, a bit like Plato did with Socrates, right? Socrates didn't write anything. Plato did, his students did, right? And so you talk to them and then you translate that into a system of thought, But you see, when you do that with your philosophical academic training, what are you doing to that knowledge? It's not as straightforward. But you had people like that. You had people like Sodipo in Nigeria, doing that, looking at, local sages, right? And, looking to, for ways of making their thoughts, systematic. But according to what? According to philosophical standards, academic philosophical standards. So I'm happy that we are talking about this because this is at the heart of our theme here. It lies at the heart of our theme. We have a problem. I mean, we are a problem. We are a problem. So this is it. Yes.
Thank you, Prof. I hope I'll be able to speak today. I hear you and I hear all those concerns and all that you're raising. But I believe that context is also important to our work, to our contribution to society and life. What you're talking about, for example, you made an example of Germany, where, life at home and at school and is not the same and so on. And they keep on making reference to those philosophers and so on. And I guess the context is very relevant, not only in Europe, maybe somewhere in Africa as well. I also have an issue with the concept of scholar. You use the concept scholar a lot. And for me, it comes as if it's like, what do we call it? School, to be schooled. You know what it means to be schooled? It has got some militaristic connotations in it. You have to be in a certain way, to be at home. We've got I don't want to call them scholars, but for the sake of this, I'll just say scholars who are interested in working with elders. I think for you do that kind of work as well. So yeah, and I find it very liberating for me as a student, as a scholar again, and to say, Ahmed, this is good. I can find something because what they're already doing, I've already done it myself. I have walked the path at home with my elders in my home and in my community and all my villages. So there's some knowledge that is not supported by or was never said by, say, Plato, but I got it somewhere on the soil. And I want to grow with this knowledge. I want to nourish it and nurture it and put it to the center. How do I do that? Because this knowledge is just oral, it's somewhere else. So those are the few, because of time that I can raise for now. But yeah, I'm just wondering what's your response to that? Because like you're saying, we refer back to science and all that, and I choose to not to dispute it in that arrogant way, but in that arrogant way. That is, yeah.
To be human.
But, yeah, I leave it
I think it's a challenge. Whichever way we look at it, it is a challenge. And I think the best we can do, or at least the best I can do, I don't know about you, about others, but the best I can do is really to be aware of the difficulty. So I'm always reticent about how far I can go with the claims that I'm making, especially when those claims puts me in a position where I have to talk on behalf of other people. I mean, maybe this is not a situation that you are confronted with every day, but that's definitely the situation I'm confronted with every day because I live in Europe. And so there, everything I do is always interpreted as the African way of doing things, right? So I lose my personality, my individuality. I can't even misbehave, right? Because all eyes on me, and I know that through me, yeah, it's Africa that people are looking at. So you see, that's a heavy burden, and so all I can do, and maybe that's why I focus a lot in my work on methodology. So all I can do is really reflect on the kind of knowledge I'm able to produce given the circumstances within which I do my work. It's not easy. That's all I can say. It's hard. And of course, scholarship, I agree with you. I mean, we also use the word discipline. We are from disciplines because, we are disciplined to look at the world in certain ways, right? So that's that's our lot. It's not an easy one, but that's it. But we can I think we can achieve a lot, and that's why I insist, for example, on this idea that we cannot allow ourselves to be reduced to the position of people who only do work that is relevant for Africa. You know, the work we do, the knowledge we produce on Africa should be relevant to other people.
Merci. En fait, moi, je crois que ce débat nous installe davantage dans la problématique d'hier. Que devrions-nous savoir pour que nos travaux connaissent davantage de succès? Et bon, je me suis dit que le professeur nous a posé cette question, mais on a essayé de répondre à cette question seulement de façon pratique. Au lieu de dire ce que nous devrions savoir pour que nos connaissances, pour que nos travaux de recherche connaissent du succès, c'est par un exercice. Car moi, je me dis que les exercices que nous faisons depuis l'ouverture de cette école d'été, répartis en groupes, nous sommes tous issus du continent africain, mais nous ne venons pas tous du même pays. Du coup, quand on a à analyser un concept, chacun d'entre nous a une vision particulière de ce concept, ou parfois même différente, et ça n'empêche pas d'avoir des échanges riches et fructueux. Donc, pour moi, en tant que chercheur, nous devrions reconnaître que le monde offre beaucoup de possibilités. Le savoir est immense et il y a des aspects qui nous échappent. De ce fait, il nous incombe aussi de réinterroger nos pratiques habituelles et de ne pas les prendre pour une évidence ou une vérité figée, mais se dire que ce n'est pas parce qu'une conception quelconque ne nous arrange pas ou du moins est différente qu'elle est forcément fausse ou mauvaise. Si je ne me trompe pas, en Europe, il y a eu un moment où on interdisait l'étude de la pensée décoloniale parce que, en fait, il y a deux extrémités à éviter. Et ça, Aimé Césaire avait averti. Quand Césaire dit il y a deux façons de se perdre, par ségrégation muée dans le particulier et par dissolution dans l'universel. Ce n'est pas parce que les Occidentaux ont dit un ensemble de choses sur nous qui ne nous arrangent pas qu'on va automatiquement laisser ça de côté. Et c'est ce qui a expliqué aussi cette incompréhension, j'ose dire, entre Martien Toa, philosophe africain, et les autres. N'oublions pas que Toa a été taxé de complexé et autres parce que sa démarche est différente des autres. Lui, qu'est-ce qu'il prône? Il prône qu'on se réapproprie la civilisation occidentale. Mais quand on se réapproprie cette civilisation, c'est après pour aller au-delà de cette civilisation et montrer les limites. Si aujourd'hui je veux critiquer un Kant ou un Platon, c'est pas en ignorant la quintessence de la pensée platonicienne ou kantienne, mais il faudrait d'abord que je sache ce qu'ils ont dit, dans quel contexte ils l'ont dit et quelles sont aussi les implications. Donc, ceci pour dire que notre rapport avec le savoir, c'est comme en fait, disons, les lunettes que nous portons pour voir le monde. De la même façon que les lunettes que nous portons ont différentes couleurs, de cette même façon aussi, le savoir est immense. Je ne fais pas un appel au relativisme, non, qui consiste à dire que oui, chacun a sa vérité, non. Mais c'est une question de reconnaître le pluralisme, d'accepter d'aller vers l'autre en étant ancré, c'est vrai, sur ses principes, mais qu'on peut apprendre beaucoup de l'autre et qu'on pourrait aussi s'améliorer. Et du coup, moi, je me dis que tout cela nous permettra de voir à quel point aussi le savoir est politique. Merci.
Non, tout à fait. Je suis tout à fait d'accord, mais il y a encore d'autres commentaires. On commence par...
Yeah, I think I kind of align with what she's saying, but what has been said there too. I think unapologetically, like centering our people, is should be what we do. Really, it's not only should be what we do, but like there's a lot of African Black scholars that think that their work is not political and that they're researching something that's applicable. But by the very being that you're in a space that you were never allowed to be in, it will be political. So centering them and being unapologetic about that centering should be how we move. Like, because whether or not you choose it, your work will be labeled or constrained in a certain view from the other side. But the mere fact is also that to allow that to confine us to certain knowledges is also very reactionary and also following in the path that was laid out to us. So if I want to read Marx and critique him and use his work, then I should, but I shouldn't do it in a way that it is like basically a copy paste version. Like many of the scholars that I use, if you look at Rodney, and Daye, these people take their lineage from Marx, right? But their knowledge is generative. They understood what to critique, what to add on, what could not account for Africans or Black people, what could not account for specific countries. So I think to say, like, to unlearn and unthink is definitely something as African scholars we need to do. But to think that we can undo what has already been done is also, because you can't. I've been Western trained. I can't undo it, huh?
We do have PhDs that have gone through this process. So to unthink, you ought to have thought before to be able to that's a basic that none of us are disputing. I think what we are trying to put to the center is that perhaps it's time that we move from a place other than that which has been laid for us when we're doing our PhDs. That's all I'm saying.
Yeah, but centering your people, your everything, and rethinking things allows you to do that. But to think that we can, because we now understand how much we've been impacted by a certain discipline, to think that we can get rid of it through thinking through it or gaining new experiences, I think is impossible in some ways, because I cannot sometimes, I am training like in political science, so sometimes I really think, like, will I ever go back to Africa and like do politics? Do I really because I see myself consciously or unconsciously, even though I am always trying to like remove the biases from myself, I am Western trained, and I see it, whether it's a slip of the tongue or however you see it. So I now I have come to like accept that that is a training and that can benefit certain things in Africa, as long as I'm conscious about who I'm centering and who is leading my work and what kind of thinking is going to lead my work. So I'm not afraid of Plato and Aristotle. If I want to use them, I will use them. Generally, I don't use them because they do very little to account for the experiences of the people I'm doing research with. So just to make that point.
Okay, thank you.
I think that what we are agitating for is what Binyavanya Wainan terms, unlocking our imagination. And in unlocking our imagination, we take the construct, we take the idea and the things that have been given, and we deconstruct them and open ourselves to new possibilities. And I think that's what we are agitating for, to say that, yes, why should we start from these tools that we've been given? Because we end up finding ourselves stuck in a rut of using the exact same tools to do this extended work of critique, using those exact same tools. So how do we unlock our imagination so that we find different ways in which we are able to think about the world and see the world from our positionality? And I think that's what the agitation for is here, more than an argument around wanting to completely debunk or throw the baby with the bathwater or whatever other sentimental ideals would have. It's unlocking our imagination so that we start to think and we move from a position that speaks to our reality and use the things and use the knowledges that have been there from that particular positionality. Yeah, I think that's what.
Thank you. I think there and then there.
Okay. I think the question I want to ask seems related to the last point that was made. I know we've been talking a lot about this, but sir, please, I want you to, make a simple sentence about this question, or give me a simple sentence. How can we, as African researchers, make our works relevant to non-Africans in a simple sentence, sir? Please.
And the problem is that requirements. I wouldn't know what a simple sentence is. So we have a problem.
Okay, maybe I can rephrase. Okay, I mean, like in a very concise way, sir. Like, how can we as African researchers make our works relevant to non-Africans?
Well, I think we can make our work relevant to those who are not African by accounting for human experience. So what is it about us that is relevant to others? That's I don't know if it's a simple and concise answer, but that's all I have to say. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm a part of a group of a part of a reading group that is hosted by the University of Ghana Institute of African Studies, and 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 Studies,